So again, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Joyce.
As you can see, we have a wonderful panel of people who really, really know what they're talking about. They assure me that it's very, very new and they're learning too, but I think they know an awful lot more about it than I do. And so I'm going to get, and also I would like to explain a little bit how come the League of Women Voters is into this. You all know us as the publisher of the Guide to Elected Officials, and that we register voters and that we help with elections and that kind of thing. But we also advocate, also known as lobbying, for different positions, and we study them before we take a position on anything. In this last 2 years, we have been studying education all over the nation, the federal government and education. And we finished that, and we thought then we need to make this relate to what's going on in Arkansas. And in Arkansas, Common Core is the thing that is interesting us. And I'd like to read to you the League's position on education. A quality public education is essential for a strong, viable, and sustainable democratic society, and is a civil right. So the reason we're here today is that we really, really believe that. I'd like to introduce the panel to you. You can see their names out there, but we have Professor Sean Connors from the University in the College of Education, and Tracy Selby Tucker. There she is, down right there. Selby Tucker. She is from Little Rock, the Director of Curriculum and Instruction Unit of Arkansas Department of Education, and we really appreciate her making that special effort to be here tonight. Marcia Jones is from the Springdale School District. She's the Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction. And Kay Jacoby, she is the Director of Curriculum and Instruction in Fayetteville. Down at the end is Nancy Smith, and she is here from the trenches. She is a kindergarten teacher at Butterfield Trail School. So we'll get right down to the questions and answers. Well, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to ask each of them to answer a question or two, and we'll see if they can sort of get started. And then I'm going to let them talk about anything they want to, and then we're going to let you ask some questions, and they will do their best to answer them for you. And I'm going to move down there so I can look at the people I'm talking to. We need to get a definition of what the Common Core really is all about. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Which one of you people would like to answer that? Maybe Marcia, you can talk about that since you seem to have prepared a wonderful booklet on the subject.
Well, thank you very much for this invitation, and it is collectively our pleasure to be here. I know I've touched base with my colleagues about that. This is a very important topic, and we're thrilled that in your term of advocacy that you're becoming learners about this. The greatest way I can start, and I am going to defer to my colleagues here in a minute because it is a complex conversation. We are, as a nation, obligated to be competitive worldwide. And the conversation about whether or not what we were asking our kids to know and be able to do was rigorous enough was really causing great concern in comparison to international standards of performance, such as on the NAEP or other international tests. And so, in a volunteer environment across the nation, leaders in education, at higher education, public education, got together and they said, we need to create a set of learning standards that are competitive at an international level. And so they began working to create that much more rigorous set of standards. And through the course of our conversation tonight, you're going to hear a lot more about perhaps what that looks like. It is a complex issue to be an educator. It's a complex issue to be a learner. When we start talking about what kids need to know and be able to do, then it says, well, how are you going to deliver it in a way that's more rigorous? How are you going to assess it in a way that's more rigorous? Which then triggers, well, how are you going to prepare your teachers to understand how to do those things? Which triggers what materials and supplies you're going to use to get that work finished. Which triggers how do our parents understand when what they're doing at home doesn't look like what we used to do, and I can't help my child with homework anymore. So it's a very complex condition that says we're moving into what's called Common Core standards, or in reality, the question now is, are children going to be college or career ready based on international standards? Not to allow me to dominate this, I think I'm going to defer and I think if it's all right with you, Madam, that we would let each of us kind of address it from a lens. I've given you an introduction, and then I think it'd be fleshed out if we could all kind of talk about that. So defining Common Core, I think, is our first task. So Tracy, if you'd like to start. Oh, by the way, I'm the Associate Superintendent with the Springdale School District, and if it works or fails in Springdale, it's my fault. So.
Big task, Marsha, big task. Okay, so I'm going to go and clarify or expand, I guess is the word I'll use, on a couple of things that Marsha said that I think really bring value and merit to the work going on in our nation right now. Those of us who have been in education for a large number of years know that it has been in the past each state's responsibility to determine their own learning standards for their students. So every state in our nation had their own set of standards. So we would spend lots of time, money, and energy in Arkansas developing standards, while our friends in Tennessee did the same thing, while our friends in New York, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Washington, Oregon, all of these states developed their own standards. So one of the most exciting things about the Common Core state standards are that they, for the first time, bring all of the states who have adopted them, which right now is sitting at about 40, we think 44, but it could have dropped to 43. We've had some leadership turnovers in some states, and so one or two may have dropped out and another one came on, but we're going to use 44. But for the first time, we all have a common set of standards. In other words, we have all sat down and agreed that these are the things that we think students should know, understand, and be able to do at all grades, kindergarten through 12. The powerful piece of that, from my perspective, is that this is also the first time that work that has gone on to support educators, to help us implement these standards, to help us learn better from each other how to teach students what it is that we want them to know, understand, and be able to do, can be shared by each state and is appropriate for each state. When I first started teaching and we went through the textbook or instructional material process, it was not uncommon to get a textbook that was on our state adoption list that the majority of us knew had been written for the learners in another state and based upon the standards for another state. So the exciting thing about the work going on in our nation right now around Common Core is that the work that we're doing in Arkansas is building off of the same set of standards that our friends in New York are working on. So what we expect our students to know, understand, and be able to do in any of these states that have adopted the Common Core state standards is that expectation is consistent across all states. And I think that's one of the biggest benefits. You've heard lots of information, I'm sure, in the news over the past several years about Race to the Top grants and states got money to do this. The interesting thing about this process and how educators are able to support each other as we go through this process of implementing the Common Core state standards is that all of the work being done across our nation is now applicable to all of us. And we get to share in that work, and we get to share. I wouldn't be surprised if Nancy hasn't seen something that's come out of a classroom in New York or Rhode Island or Massachusetts, and it works for her kids right here in Arkansas. So that's one of the neat things about this work that's going on. In Fayetteville, we typically refer to the Common Core State Standards as a set of learning expectations for all kids, grades K through 12 in English Language Arts, that we expect them to learn to a high degree of proficiency that will eventually be measured with some common assessments that are coming down the pike, and those will begin in school year 14-15. Mathematics works just a little bit different because those are applicable to students in kindergarten through Algebra 2. You know, once we get in high school, it's not 9th grade math and 10th grade math, but those are designed by the name of the course. So the Common Core Standards in mathematics are for kiddos from kindergarten through Algebra 2. And what we're excited about is they are standards that all kids must learn and show their proficiency on. As they work through the grades, we'll eventually be able to know who is on track to graduate college and career ready and who isn't. And therefore, what are the interventions? What is it that we need to do as a local district, as a campus, as teachers, to ensure that those kids get back on track, so that when they leave the 11th grade, they have met those college and career readiness standards. And our expectation is that every student in every classroom and every day in our district is about the business of working on mastering those particular standards.
Well, the Common Core to me is implementing what we've been given with math. We've been given the new Common Core standard 2 years ago. We started, but we haven't adopted. We just have adopted our new curriculum that we'll be getting and starting next year. So the past 2 years for me has been learning how to finding ideas from different teachers around the country, around the state. We, as a team, the Fayetteville Kindergarten has gotten together several times. We've worked on aligning our curriculum to the new core standards. It's a work in progress. Language arts, the Fayetteville curriculum, there's a team that's put together the language arts program that we are implementing, and it is a lot to learn, a lot of new stuff that the children there's a lot of changes, and there's a lot of adjustments. I feel like I'm in a different place than all of these people here. There's some really exciting new things that we're learning, and the kids are doing great at. There's some that are a little bit more struggled. But one thing I just want to touch on is the math. It's been really exciting because there's less standards. So instead of going shallow with many standards, there's less standards that we can go deeper to make sure the children really understand the concepts. So that's just a little bit.
My name, can you hear me? My name is Sean Connors, and I'm assistant professor in the College of Education and Health Professions. I want to clarify. I did tell Jeannie I have to excuse myself at 7:20. It is not because you want to work me up to a level of anxiety that I'm leaving in the room. I'm thinking of a speaker from the college in the airport.
You're going to have to speak into that little thing.
Really, I guess just building on what my colleagues have said, my view of the Common Core, I guess I would say I'm sort of an educational vagabond. I grew up in New York. I taught high school in New York for 6 years. Then I taught high school in Arizona for another 6 years before moving to Ohio and getting my doctorate and coming here to Arkansas. And one of the things that I saw moving around as a teacher from state to state is just, as I think as Marcia described, very, very different sets of standards for students, but also very different measures of assessment for students. And what students might be asked to do to show competency in New York or Arizona varied incredibly. from what students in Arkansas or Ohio might ask to do. The other thing that I see the Common Core doing is trying to deepen our level of study of issues like reading and writing, subjects like reading and writing. So that when I initially began here at the university 2.5 years ago and began to explore the Arkansas frameworks, what I saw, and especially in practice when I go into classrooms, is they became almost a checklist of sorts, of skills, things. Have you covered these sorts of things? And the Common Core doesn't really allow for that. It isn't a checklist. It's taking issues around reading and writing and exploring them much more substantively.
And what does how is the university educating the new teachers about all of this?
Well, it's really requiring us to rethink. In some ways, it's requiring us to rethink what we do. In some ways, it isn't. I think the majority of my colleagues, we advocate a progressive pedagogy, an inquiry-based pedagogy. So in that sense, I think what we've been doing historically meshes with the expectations of Common Core. Where it does change things for us, I can speak for me personally, teaching literature methods courses or writing methods courses, is the level of depth that we have to go into with our students. Because our students come through, my students come through a literature program at the university as their content area background. So they've taken Composition 1 and Composition 2. And then really, as far as writing classes, that's about the extent, unless they choose to take a creative writing class. The bulk of the classes are literature. So that when I get them, the idea of teaching someone to write is incredibly new. And where the Common Core presents a problem is that it requires teachers to have a very, very deep understanding of issues of writing, around writing, and be able to communicate those issues to students. So one of the challenges for us is sort of figuring out not only how to teach people to teach writing, but also teach these students to think on deeper levels about the way that they interact with text as readers and writers. So in a lot of ways, it's requiring us to rethink what we do and rethink the nature of our program.
Thank you. Perhaps, Tracy, you could tell us how come Arkansas is decided to do this, and how many more states are involved with it?
Okay, on July the 12th of 2010, the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts and Mathematics were adopted by our State Board of Education, and a process to implement those Common Core State Standards began. I think right now we're one of 44 states who are implementing the Common Core State Standards, and I could rattle off to you tons of reasons why Common Core came to be, if you will. One interesting thing I think is worth pointing out is that the original concern and the vision for common standards across state lines actually came from our National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, which would be the head education chiefs in each state. They are the ones who came together and had concerns, and Marcia touched a little bit on this when she talked about why Common Core and what is Common Core. Those two groups of people came together and shared concerns about the state of education. They shared concerns about the assessments and how different assessments were across our states and what they measure and how they're differently, and it's hard to compare kids across state lines. And so the desire and the work around the development of the standards began with those two groups. There's tons of research, and there are many, many statistics out there that we could quote you that would signify why they came to be. Marcia talked about the need for our students to be able to compete globally for jobs, the need for our students to graduate our Arkansas schools college and career ready. On the drive up, I was sharing one of the original statistics that we got at our department, and we've worked on that thanks to our legislative committee and others in our state, but one of the original figures that we got put the price tag of remediation, and with that I'm meaning those students who graduated Arkansas high schools, went on to college, and were required to take a remedial, or some people call it a developmental course in college, before they could begin to take a credit-bearing course in college. That's what we call remediation. original estimates of the cost to Arkansas for those students who had to have those remediation rates was hitting about $60 million. Now, through better accounting, I think, perhaps, and perhaps better even recognition in our high schools, that we need to do more to prepare our students for those type courses, that number has dropped down to around $18 million. But that $18 million is spent on students that are graduating our schools and going on to college, and they're not scoring high enough on an ACT or another placement exam to take a credit-bearing course in college. So that is why Common Core. That's a huge reason for Common Core.
Another really big statistic that's been brought to our attention, Arkansas is in constant competition with people bringing jobs into states. And part of what a new employer looks for is the percent of people with college degrees. And there are companies that if your state doesn't meet a certain threshold, such as having 25% or 28% of your people having a college degree, they won't even consider coming to a state. Arkansas is one of the lower states when it comes to having people with college degrees, somewhere between 19 and 20%. Northwest Arkansas is a little bit higher, but even the Northwest Arkansas Council is concerned that even Northwest Arkansas is not competitive with other cities that get particularly high-paying, high-wage industries, technology industries specifically. So when we start saying that it's college and or career and everybody has to reach the same bar, it's because we have to tap into a group of students to be prepared to go to college who may have never considered doing that. And there may be people in this room that were first-time college graduates in their families. Well, all the kids whose parents know they should go to college are going, right? So who do we have to convince now? Who do we have to prepare now? Kids who've never considered going to college or who have not successfully completed college because they weren't well prepared. They weren't well prepared somewhat because we were allowing a multiple pathway through school, that some of which was not preparing them at a rigorous enough level to get into college. We're not hearing language that says everybody should go to college. That's not what we're saying. The college and career ready standards are trying to ensure that no pathway is closing a student to be encouraged to go to some kind of post-high school environment, whether it's a 2-year institution, a technical institute, or a 4-year college. But beyond that, and the governor has made this a priority for his work, we have to increase the number of college graduates with BAs in particular areas such as technology and engineering.
It's because our kids are lacking the depth of understanding that would have come from having had Common Core math in the prior grades, if I said that in a way that makes sense to you. So that's a little bit of what we're dealing with this year. We don't think that will happen again next year. We just think that first year and entering into something that is so much more rigorous and the content standards in math are quite different, that we think that's what has caught us in that particular situation for this year. So just takes a little more time with those kiddos in Common Core math the first year. So we're having to adjust our curriculum maps, and our teachers are very adept at doing that. We meet with them 4 times a year, and so we really look at, did first quarter maps work the way we thought they would? Were we able to get as far as we thought we would get in the first quarter? If not, how do we need to change what we're doing second quarter to accommodate for what we didn't get to the first quarter? And so your first year of implementing a new curriculum, that's just kind of the name of the game. And we'll be in better shape come next year, as Nancy has said, working with those particular selections and the units that we're teaching in kindergarten And then we'll be better prepared for instruction with our kids next year as well.
One thing we haven't talked about, is the testing. How are we going to know whether this is working or not? Tracy, are you the one who writes the test?
No, ma'am. I'm the one who talks about what it is that students are expected to know, understand, and be able to do. But I can talk about assessments. I want to go back and expand on something that Kate said just now. In the way that we used to do business in Arkansas was that we revised our standards for a different subject every year. And we had a cycle. And so about every 7 years, we start that cycle again. And Dr. Gail Potter used to be at the department. She was the director of curriculum instruction for many, many years, and she retired back in the spring. And we were sitting in the office one day at the big conference table before she left, and she said, "All right, I have a few things I need to tell you ladies, and I want you to listen to me." And so one of the very first things that she said, and I think we've alluded to it up here tonight, but I don't think any of us have come out and just said it directly. This particular process is a change process. It's a change process for our district staff, our district level administrators, because they're having to have different conversations now with their teachers. They're having to have different conversations with their patrons, different conversations with their business leaders in their community. It's a change process for our teachers. We're asking them to teach different standards. That's nothing new in our state. What is new is that the standards are more rigorous, they're more relevant, they're taking us to levels of teaching that we haven't experienced before. I use this example all the time. I came through teacher training and I learned that checklist. And you want to talk about somebody that could do a checklist, I was comfortable with that. But that type of teaching and that type of approach to learning for students with Common Core state standards just doesn't work. So that requires what Kay and Marcia have both talked about. That requires a lot of time for our teachers to sit and have conversations about what it really means when you see that standard. What does that standard really mean that a child needs to be able to do? And then you have to think backwards from that. Well, if this is what they have to be able to do, then what are those skills that they need to have mastered along the way as they progress in their learning so that they can do this when I try to teach it to them? So this is a process, Dr. Potter says from back in the summer before she left, this is not a process that you're going to be able to mark off your list and say, woo, it's done, when that new assessment arrives in 2014, 2015. This is a way of thinking about teaching and learning that is vastly different than what we've had in our education system in our nation for a very long time. And if we're not sitting here, some of us, in 20 years, having this very same conversation about making sure our students are college and career ready and more rigorous learning activities for them in our schools and integrating technology and approaches to text and what materials we want our students to be taught with, we'll all be very surprised. It's going to be a long-term process. That's what change is. So,
Sue, do you still have those samples? Our colleague from the co-op, I brought some released item samples that we can just kind of float among the audience. The nature of assessment is much more complex as well. Now I'm going to see if I can recall a sample, but you can just flip through and see. They're multifaceted, they have multiple parts. They're going to be computerized, so kids are going to have to cut and paste and highlight and drop and drag to bring the computer, type in a text box. So there's all the computer complexities that we're trying to work through. Now I'll give you an example of what I think is a third grade task that is using fractions. Now you have to visualize this a minute. You've got 3 sacks. And those 3 sacks can each hold a certain amount, a weight of jars. The first sack can hold 2 pounds, the second sack can hold between 10 to 12 pounds, and the third sack can hold 12 to 15 pounds. And sitting over on the side of your computer desk are pictures of jars that weigh 1 3/8 pounds apiece. And you are to be putting the jars into the sack to make sure that you don't break the sack. Now, the math of it would say, can you add fractions? The logic of it says, I have to know when to stop adding fractions. Because what's going to happen? If I put too many jars in the sack will break. So my mathematics number, add, I then have to come back as a third grader and logically analyze which of the sacks can hold how many jars each. That might be an example of having to round down in order to complete the task. But here's another example. I need to put this whole room full of people into cars because we're going to take a trip to St. Louis. If I round down, I'm going to be cutting some of you in half. So I have to know logically when to round up and when to round down. And 5 times 6 might not be the answer of 30 every time. Analyzing the complex, multiple-faceted pieces of a problem to make a logical, reasoned, deductive answer using numbers. What did we call that in the old days? Word problems. Today, it is simply Common Core assessment. It's contextual mathematics, using it so it makes sense. Now, there are 3 kinds of tasks in the reading assessment and the literary assessment. There's a simulated research. An example that's in the little book that's floating around is children will be given passages to read. This is a 7th grade example, I believe. And those passages are going to be somewhere between 800 to 1,000 words. On Amelia Earhart. There are different stories about what happened to her. And so you're to, as a student, in your time you're given for the assessment, read the 3 texts, do some comparison and contrasting on the perspectives that the authors give to her life and her potential death. And then you are to write answers to a question about why you believe a certain author's perspective is accurate to that. And you have to cite the evidence out of the text that says, I'm believing in this because I read it in text. Now, if any of you have done graduate work, you know that that is how you write graduate work papers. You don't have ideas of your own. You do what? You reference text. I know this because this author, who's smarter than I am about it, tells me that's true. And that's the college kind of readiness level we're talking about. It's not creative writing. It's referencing text in a simulated research model. We've got a problem in our community that's a little bit unique. We have Marshallese children whose grandparents think they know that Amelia Earhart landed in the Marshall Islands. So we've got to make sure that those children don't bring background knowledge of tradition into the writing experience to influence what they think the right answer is. Now, I'm just using that because that's a sample, but that's the kind of thing that as a college student, I'm not bringing background knowledge, I'm bringing knowledge of text by authors who have researched it. So there's simulated research, that's the type. There's analytical reading, where you're doing close reading and you're looking at nuances, vocabulary, syntax structure, how the author perceives a position, how they make a point. And then you're doing informational writing, describing how a law of physics actually works, for example. So the level of writing and reading increasing, the level of text complexity increasing, mathematics, the level of reasoned logic as numbers apply to contextual problem solving. And again, those samples are kind of going around, and you're welcome to look at them.
Thank you very much. I just have one comment. I don't know what it is we pay you all, but it's not enough. Does the audience have any questions they'd like to ask these brilliant people? And speak out nice and loud, too, so we can all hear it.
I understand that you're going to be including more nonfiction at all levels. just maybe pick out a few levels and give us specific examples of what the nonfiction might be.
I can't think of any titles.
I think this is a topic around our nation that's actually getting quite a bit of conversation, and I think it's very interesting. I served for years in a rural school district, and I could take any type of data that I had in my school from way back then. We were talking about this on the way up. It didn't matter if it was just teacher observation in the classroom, or if it was Arkansas benchmark data, or if it was anything. Didn't matter. My kids, the majority of which were from poverty, struggled with nonfiction. And we figured out real quick when we were tweaking our curriculum that was something that we needed to address. And the root of that, once we got into it, was because many of our students didn't have any of those experiences to relate anything back to. So I think it's very interesting that nonfiction has gotten the talk that it has here lately with Common Core, because many of us were struggling with nonfiction before Common Core even came along. I don't know if that was true for you guys, but that was a struggle for many of our schools in our state, even under the Arkansas frameworks. When we talk about nonfiction, we're talking about science text, social studies text. We're talking about real-life, relevant literature that our students sometimes grapple with because of the vocabulary, or because they don't have that background knowledge or those experiences to build on that. So out of that focus on nonfiction text has arisen this idea that all teachers in the school are a literacy teacher for their content. We're not asking social studies and science teachers to teach kids how to write or how to identify a noun or a verb. We're asking them to use their content, social studies, science, career and technical, computer business applications, to make sure that their students are proficient or are comfortable with the text that they're using. In other words, let's make sure that our students understand the vocabulary from science. Let's make sure that they understand the concept, and that they can take that information and write about it and read and have a conversation or make a presentation on that. So anyway, that's kind of my take on nonfiction. You guys jump in.
If I can recall the question, percentage-wise, in the primary grade, it's 50-50, 50% informational, 50% literary. As it goes through the grades, it shifts a little bit to the fact that at the high school level, 30% of the students' exposure to literary works, they should be literary, and 30% and 70% informational. Now, that doesn't mean the English department can't continue to teach literature. They certainly should. But that also means that the science department and the social studies department are going to have to start picking up authentic text out of Scientific American. An example of social studies type of environment might be reading Letters from a Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King and comparing that to the Emancipation Proclamation. How do those things compare, contrast? What's the perspective of the writer, and how do they relate to one another? So primary documents, particularly at the high school level, authentic historical resources, such as I mentioned, technical manuals. We're going to have a workshop with our professor at the university that we respect greatly, Dr. David Jolliffe. He's going to be working with our career technical people in business. And you may have had this experience yourself or expected of your employees. I give you the manual of what the new technology system is for your area, and I expect by Monday for you to have learned what that is all about. I'm not going to spoon feed you. Students should be exposed to technical manuals. So we're asking our CTE people to get technical manuals, bring them to a training session so we can teach them how to teach their students analytical reading and writing using technical manuals. Here's another phenomena that we're having to struggle with. some of the sophisticated text at high school that's in Common Core is not sheltered from profanity or explicit examples of circumstances in life. That is going to be sometimes a little hard for some parents who don't want that, or some of us as educators, because we have not had texts that have been as sophisticated, and I don't know how to say that more gently, than what is on this anchor text list. And what plays in New York City doesn't always play well in Springdale. So we're kind of struggling, Tracy, to get some of those anchor books replaced with literature that we think our parents won't be offended by. And as we grow through this process, you're going to need to help us understand what we can tolerate and what we're going to have to not be so patient with. Can you help us?
And I think my take on that would be, and so much of the standards do talk about exactly what it is that students are expected to know, understand, and do. But just like Nancy was talking earlier, it's hit or miss when it comes to using a text in your class, even right now. I can assure you, she has chosen a text before and sat down to do a shared reading with a group of kindergarten students, and it just doesn't go the way she thinks it's going to go. So you monitor and adjust. There is a list of texts in Common Core that are suggested, but I don't think it's anything that any of us have to vary. So my recommendation to you as a district would be, and I haven't heard that before, this is the first time that I've heard that, you're just now finding the appendix that those are in. But you are responsible for your own curriculum, and so if it doesn't work for you, pick something that does. Because I assure you, you've got a great resource sitting right there beside you. You can find something that is appropriate that will work for you that does the same type thing. So
I would just add to that, in terms of last year when we met with our teachers at grade levels and began this whole process of developing units and what text will we use to ask kids to read within the study of the unit. One of the kind of non-negotiables or parameters that we set was this has to be appropriate to our community. And I think each community kind of finds its place with those kinds of issues. And our teachers didn't have a problem with that at all. We found other texts, and oh my goodness, of all of the hundreds of thousands that are available to choose from, it just wasn't a problem for us to be able to identify some appropriate ones. Challenging, yes, and challenging both in terms of human connection, et cetera. But that was just a parameter that we set when we developed our own curriculum. We would steer away from those kinds of.
And I've just got to compliment Marcia for one of the most remarkable euphemisms I've ever heard for offensive language and sexual content.
Yes.
Yesterday there was an article that came out from the U.S. Department of Education that was talking about the graduation rate in the nation, and that we'd actually hit a high of 78% on our graduation rate. But that still means that we have quite a significant number of students who are not graduating in 4 years. And considering Common Core and things that I've heard you all talk about and other professionals in the field talk about, it's difficult for me to reconcile in my own mind that a student who is already struggling today, wherever they are in the system, is going to be able to catch up and keep up and graduate. And my concern is that we're actually going to see the graduation rate decline as a result of this. And how are you all responding to that, and what steps are you taking to anticipate those problems and address them?
I think one of the things that has been the most difficult for many of our educators in our state to wrap their brain around is the fact that in a few years from now, when I get a student who's had Nancy as a kindergarten teacher, I'm not going to get the same students that I would have gotten 5 years ago. When she talks about that deeper learning, we've gone from a system in some grades that have had 140 things that they're responsible for teaching down to a list of about 23. So the foundational skills that the students have once they have been entrenched in Common Core is going to be much deeper. So we're going to see a different student who has been given assessments that tell us whether or not they're on track to being college and career ready since they were in the 3rd grade. I think that puts a huge amount of responsibility back on our schools to make sure that they're paying attention to the data that they're getting from those assessments, to make sure that those students receive the interventions and remediations that they need along the way to make sure that they are on a pathway to college and career readiness by the time they graduate our high schools.
I would add, and your question's a wonderful one, and I would be remiss to say taking the schools entirely out of the picture. And when you look at our schools, our public schools' performance on standardized tests, and you compare those internationally, we lag. When you remove poverty from the issue, we do remarkably well, particularly for dealing with diversity that other countries do not. So schools removed, what I argue, try to argue with my colleagues and my students, my peers, is that until, I think Martin Luther King said, if we want to have truly excellent education in the country, we're going to address the issue of poverty, because until we do, we can't, probably your referencing isn't going to change, regardless of what standards we adopt.
I agree with you.
I'm also really excited about I'll use the big term, the pedagogical changes, how the classrooms are functioning. Thank you, Sean. One of the things that is we had a witness to this yesterday, changes in the classroom that provide students more choice, more project-based learning, more connections to real-life environments, is stimulating youngsters who have never been successful before. I'll give you a little bit of an example, a personal example. My grandson is a typical 13-year-old. And when you say, how was school? He says, football was great, English was not so good. He was really not doing well in his English class, and we were trying to figure out what was going on. And he just didn't like to read, he still doesn't really like to read. Well, could he not read, or was he not willing to read? Well, his dad decided that he'd bring home the book, and some of you may have read it, The Kite Runners. Did you ever read that? Pretty sophisticated book. His dad was in Afghanistan, books about Afghanistan. All of a sudden, this kid who can barely survive his English class is reading Kite Runners. Why? Because he's connected to choice. He's got a mentor through his dad. It's of interest to him, and he can read whatever he chooses to read. Teachers are figuring this out as a catalyst to get reluctant learners engaged in reading. We had a mom tell us yesterday, my child was struggling, but her teacher is now giving him more choice about what he reads, and he has skyrocketed in his reading. We think that some of the dysfunction of how kids proceed through school has been directly linked to a lack of choice and engagement, and that's what Common Core allows us to do, and I am really, really excited. And I've got some teachers in here that are giving us the amen, and I love that, because it's really, and I think it's more fun in class, isn't it? A little bit more fun. Yes, sir.
I'm afraid the person who can answer this question just left the room. But what concerns me over the years reading about schooling is that you're comparing results in the United States with other countries. Well, I have lived in 3 European countries, and I sent my kids to school in one of those, Germany, Austria, and Great Britain. Now, all 3 of those countries have what we would call 2-track systems, whereas in the United States, generally speaking, we do not. We have a comprehensive system. So is that comparison valid? Are we comparing them with only what we would call college preparatory schools in Europe? Or are we comparing them with all schools? I mean, for example, in Austria and Germany, you leave school at 16 and go into an apprentice system.
We concur. We're getting children out of Mexico who have not ever been in school since 4th grade, and we're having to put them in 10th grade. We understand that the systems are not comparable, and that sometimes we can be frustrated with why we get such a bad rap, but we're trying to work on the hand that we're dealt, and that is to make good learning a school. Have you ever known somebody whose 8th grade counselor said, young man, you're never going to make it in college, just go down and get a job at the hardware store? And that person turns out to be your medical doctor. We educators have had a little bit of a problem with sometimes prejudging kids based on socioeconomic background or second language or whatever. We're trying very hard never to put a glass ceiling on a kid, and that's what Common Core pushes us to do, is to say, we're going to get you ready for whatever, we're not going to put any limits on you, you go through as far as fast as you can, and that's that college career mentality. If kids choose to go down and work at the hardware store, okay. But it's not because we force them to have that as their only choice. I agree with you, sir. The data comparisons are very ragged, but we can't really influence that. That's politics at its highest, probably.
I would just like to add one thing about Marcia's connection with the kite runner with her grandson. There's a word that those of us who work in Fayette will know and have come to embrace, and that is relevance. In fact, we talk about rigor. I think we've given you an idea about what that is in terms of learning, in terms of teaching, in terms of assessment. We also talk about relevance, and relevance is the learning meaningful to the child, whether that be a 6-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old. And that transfers in our district to the units of study that our teachers built last year in English Language Arts. Relevance was the filter. We can get it rigorous, but the question was with all of the teams is what we're having these kids read and learn and do relevant to their world? And so that was huge for us in the development of our units. And as we're implementing those units this year, who better to go to than the kids? We were wanting to have some feedback from them about were they finding their units of study in English Language Arts this year different. We were hoping they could tell a difference, but we really didn't know that. So we went to 7th graders. 7th graders will tell you exactly what's on their minds. You know that. And so we just said, the kinds of things that you're experiencing in your English classes this year, and the reading and writing that you're doing, do you note anything different? And can you put that into words for us? And so what they told us was, it's a lot more engaging, and they used that word. And they said, it's a lot more fun learning together. We collaborate more this year than we ever have before. And then they would tell us things like, and it relates to me. What I'm learning relates to me. And so we'd like to think that at least in 7th grade with those groups of youngsters that the issue of relevance in what they were studying at that particular period in time really came home to the groups that we were hoping it would be meaningful to as well. So rigor, relevance, and the third word for us is relationships. And we typically say we really can't take kids where we need to take them without developing that strong relationship with them first. And Dr. Daggett would say relationship building allows us to get to the rigor and the relevance that all kids need to maximize their learning potential.
one of the things we haven't really talked about, a couple of things we haven't talked about, but one that came to my mind when Kay was talking was this idea of differentiated learning activities or learning opportunities, I'll say, for our students. I thought of this when you mentioned the grandson and kite runner. One of the things that we're hearing from teachers across the state as we're in workshops and talking about Common Core and specifically text and things that interest kids, they're really beginning to see the needs in the classrooms to provide text or learning opportunities that are different based upon their genders in the classroom. We've had teachers tell us, well, I'll put my boys on this side of the room and we'll use this text that's around a central theme that's in line with their unit they've planned, but on this side of the room I may have my girls working and we're doing something totally different. One real-life situation was a theme that an English teacher was doing with ninth graders. She had the boys over here reading a nonfiction text that was on this theme, but she had girls over here reading poetry. And the girls, some of the girls were not big readers, as you mentioned, but poetry seemed to capture them. And it totally changed the classroom environment. They could still come together and have those discussions, but the texts that they had used for their learning were completely different. So we're hearing a lot about teachers really taking the time and studying to figure out what it is that I can do in my classroom to make the learning relevant, to make it rigorous where it needs to be with Common Core, and still meet the individual needs of my students. So very time-consuming.
One more question, we better call it a day.
Where do the libraries and librarians fit into the Common Core? And I'm thinking in part about reader advisory that librarians learn to suggest ever more sophisticated books to kids on the subjects that they've learned they're interested in.
One of the things that we've done is our media specialists are doing all of the units of study at all of the grade levels so that they're aware of the texts that are being utilized in classrooms so that when they have an opportunity to purchase additional texts, they are about the same themes so that when kids have independent time and self-selected readings, that they have a reserve of those. Media specialists are also very helpful in the research piece because all teachers, English teachers now, are teaching research, and it is many times the media specialists and the librarians who have that expertise already and can assist teachers with that.
On behalf of the thank you tonight for your expertise and for the time you've given us, it's been terrific. We'd like to share with you a document that the League of Women Voters of Arkansas produces, which is called Government in Arkansas. Nonfiction. This is right. Yeah, we are trying to make democracy work, and this is a wonderful resource for you and your colleagues, and perhaps it is listed as a textbook in Arkansas if anybody in your district should choose to use it. But this is our gift to you, and with our gratitude for your hard work and the way you're moving things forward in education. Thank you so much.